As I mentioned, our first hour, I've written 2 books in the last year. The first book is called Biblical Theology and the Life of the Early Church. And it's a book about how the early church read the Bible. And that came out in April, and I talked a bit about that. And the main thesis of that book is how the Bible is a culture-shaping text. I didn't mention in the first hour, but we're seeing a lot of texts now. For example, one of the most influential is Tom Holland's book, Dominion. I don't know if you've heard about this book, but Holland, who grew up in an Anglican tradition, grew up very much in a Christendom, in a Christian culture shaped by Christianity. And Dominion is sort of Holland's intellectual wrestling with the history of the church. And his whole purpose is to simply show all the good things the church has done. He's actually telling the story of the church, all the institutions the church has built, all the governments and civilizations the church has built. So, and then Holland ends with this really kind of ominous, like, what's going to happen now as the church sort of goes through its own identity crisis. It's a massive read if you're interested. It's a massive read, but you get to the end of it and it's a staggering read. But I came out with that book, Biblical Theology and the Life of the Early Church, in April. And a year ago, last year, I wrote a book called Cultural Sanctification, Engaging the World Like the Early Church. And the books work together because the book I just came out with, I really encourage people to read it first because it talks about the Bible. It talks about how the church's cultural engagement is really built upon the way the church read and understood themselves as living the story of God. And it's fascinating to listen to the way the early church sees it as so fundamentally important to tell the story of God because of the way it shapes their life. This book, Cultural Sanctification, takes on the topic of cultural engagement, basically asking the question, how did the early church go from a few guys hanging out with Jesus to Constantine in the 4th century seeing it as politically expedient to convert to Christianity? Whether or not you think Constantine's conversion is, if you don't know, Constantine was the emperor of Rome, was very sympathetic to Christianity, had a kind of conversion experience. There's lots of debates about that. Whatever you think about that, at least it was politically expedient to become Christian. And throughout the 4th century, really the Western tradition itself was Christianized to where you get to the end of the 4th century, you got Theodosius, and you really got a Christian culture being formed. And then, of course, in the West, you move into your medieval period, then the Reformation, and we all sort of probably know some of those stories. But the larger question is, how did the early church get from kind of these guys hanging out with Jesus to, be the primary religion of the Roman Empire? The question has puzzled scholars, and I found it particularly important to go back to ask the question, not just how they did that, but how can whatever they did inspire and challenge those of us who are doing ministry in a context that actually feels very similar to that early Christian world? So that second book, Cultural Sanctification, has been really that challenge of cultural engagement in particular. In that book, like the other one, in the earlier session, I told lots of stories. I begin with the story of the bishop of Smyrna named Polycarp. Some of you, no doubt, have heard Polycarp. He wrote an epistle to the Ephesians. According to tradition, he held conversations with the Apostle John in Asia Minor. And Polycarp, in his martyrdom account, it's a fascinating story. If you've never read Polycarp's martyrdom, I encourage you to read it. But basically in this story, Polycarp's the bishop of Smyrna, and there are those who are being martyred in the amphitheater at Smyrna. And the community actually encouraged Polycarp to flee, go, because in the whole martyrdom, this is a side note, in the whole martyrdom tradition, the challenge is, what do you do with the bishop? Because if the bishop is martyred, who then leads the church? Or if you lose a pastor, who's going to be the next person to pick up? So the early church, during the martyrdom accounts, really wrestled with, what do we do with the Christian leader? Does the leader sacrifice themselves as an example, or do we sort of send them on and protect them to be able to come back and lead after the martyrdoms have subsided? So the early church struggled with that. So they at first encouraged Polycarp to leave. Polycarp leaves. He ends up in a house outside of Smyrna. And he has a vision, and he basically says, you know what? My time is up. I need to go back and sacrifice myself. So Polycarp waits there. Roman officials are dispatched. They show up at his door. They knock on his door, he lets them in, and he encourages a meal set before him. The soldiers dine in his house, and he just asks them, will you just give me a couple hours to pray? And the Martyrdom of Polycarp records, Polycarp goes into the next room, and he prays so loudly that the soldiers that are feasting on his food get convicted because this pious minister is in the other room praying for them. And it's so convicting. On the way back to the amphitheater, they're like reasoning with him. They're like, Polycarp, like, what are you doing, man? Like, just pinch a little incense to Caesar. It's not a big deal, man. You can head to Starbucks later and hang out with your congregation. Just like worship the pagan gods and be done with it. It's not a big deal. But Polycarp ignores them. He gets into the amphitheater. He's standing before a Roman proconsul. And the proconsul begins the interrogation of him. And he's like, he basically tries to persuade him and try to convince him to pinch incense to Caesar over and over again. And it builds to this point. When Polycarp confessed he was the Christian, the proconsul says, have respect for your age. And he says all these other things. Turn to the crowd and say, away with the atheists. From a Roman vantage point, the pagans were all the Christians were all atheists because they rejected the pagan gods. And so the proconsul says, turn to the crowds and say, away with the atheists. And Polycarp, in the account, this is like the ultimate mic drop, he looks up to heaven and then looks around and says, away with the atheists. Now, you got to think about it for a minute, but it's his pun, it's his play on words, in which Polycarp is pointing out the real atheists are those in the crowd who deny the confession in the one true God. And then the Roman proconsul turns to him and says, swear an oath, revile Christ. And Polycarp has that very famous line, for 86 years I've served him. How can I deny my king and my savior who saved me? Very famous line. So the proconsul said, swear by the genus of Caesar, which was a little image of Caesar. He replied, if you expect that I will swear by the genus of Caesar, you pretend that you do not know who I am. Listen carefully. I am a Christian. If you want to learn the teachings of Christianity, appoint a day and give me a proper hearing. Let's go to Starbucks. We'll hang out there for a minute. I'll open the Bible. I'll tell you all about it if you want to learn what Christianity is. I am a Christian. And Polycarp said, ignore that. Persuade the people. And then he has this line where he says, you I count worthy of a response. For we have been taught, catechized to pay proper respect to rulers and authorities appointed by God. Wow! He is quoting Romans 13 right there. He has been catechized and discipled to pay respect to civil authorities, even if those authorities are pagan. Just like Paul, just like Peter does. Fear God, honor the king. There's this whole vision of a public theology that is woven into the fabric of early Christian catechesis. But he says we've been paid to pay proper respect to authorities as long as they do us no harm. As to them, I'm not ready to bring them a defense. In other words, they were calling for his life and his death, and he was not going to utter a word like Christ before his trials. He was going to keep silent. In fact, there's a lot of debates about the way Christ responded when he uttered no words, and he let his life and his work be a testimony of his words. It's fascinating when the early church doing all these things. But he says, look, the apostle told me, so I'm going to respond. The proconsul said, I have wild beasts. I'll throw you to wild beasts unless you turn. And Polycarp said, call them. Repentance from better to worse is impossible for us. But it is good to turn away from those things that are evil towards those things that are good. And the proconsul said, I will have you consumed by fire since you don't care about wild beasts unless you turn. And Polycarp says, you threaten me with fire that'll burn for an hour and then is soon extinguished. For you do not know the coming judgment and the eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. Do what you will. Bring on what you want. And then they went into the crowd, and the proconsul had his herald walk into the middle of the amphitheater and announce, Polycarp is a Christian, Polycarp is a Christian, Polycarp is a Christian 3 times. And then he sent to his death. All right, this actually was written down and distributed around the ancient world. It would have been a model or an example that the early church would have looked to for how to respond respond to these kinds of political pressures. And in fact, we know not everyone acted in this way. In fact, I'm sure many of you in your Christian institutions, churches, know your people might not all act like Polycarps, We might not be filled with Polycarps. But in fact, there's one martyrdom account that talks about those who reviled Christ, who pinched incense to Caesar and walked away. So we know these things in the early church. They're not all kind of Polycarps in the early church, but Polycarp was circulated, his example was circulated as an example. And notice that sort of public theology is already woven into the text itself. If you've ever read Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Trueman ends that book, and he does so in his other Strange New World. He ends the book with this quote: "We are living in the second century. The second century world is a lot like our world. It is a very diverse, a very secular world." And I even, in the book, I define secular the way Charles Taylor, in his book, I mentioned Charles Taylor earlier, defines secular. In Charles Taylor's definition of secular does not mean God is removed. In fact, Taylor's whole point is that secular means God is just one option among a whole lot of options. And his point is everybody lives out some story. Everyone has some view of life. Everyone is a Platonist, an Aristotelian, a Stoic. They're all living some kind of view of the supernatural, view of ultimate reality or no reality. Whatever you confess, you are living some kind of story. That is ultimately Charles Taylor's point. And Trueman really draws on that. And so secularism now, in our modern sort of example, is not the abandonment of God. It's just the revival of a very diverse group of sets of beliefs about gods or whatever. Anything and everything is up for grabs. And the Christian vision of life is just one option among many. And the challenge we all have, and I know you all feel this, is institutional formation is always downstream of the people that inhabit those institutions. So as the secular world has come along, all of our institutions are being refashioned and reformed according to different views of reality. So whether it be a church, whether it be a school, a university, whether it be all kinds of educational institutions, whether it be government, political authorities, all kinds of institutions are being reshaped in accordance with secular mores that are no longer inhabiting our country. In fact, I'll use Tocqueville. If you know Tocqueville, he wrote Democracy in America. Very famous account that he wrote when he came to the early republic and described what he saw. And Tocqueville makes this remark that the most essential and important thing about America is religion. We don't have an established church, but the religious mores actually filter their way through every institution. And that was Tocqueville's observation. The problem now is a lot of our institutions, there are a whole variety of mores that are now filtering their way through all of our institutions. I've just as an example of this, there's a book on institutions, the de-Christianization of institutions. It uses the classic example of the Ivy Leagues. I've stood at the Johnson Gate at Harvard, the oldest gate at Harvard Square. I've stood at this gate. On the right side is the charter from the Massachusetts Bay Colony that clearly lays out Harvard's founding. You can read it today. You can go there. I was just there a few weeks ago. You can go and read the Massachusetts Bay Charter. You can actually see the old emblem of Harvard that actually has 3 books. 2 books are open, which symbolize the Old and New Testament, and then the Book of Reason that's closed, that's turned on the other side. You can see about, and that's just an example of an institution that has been reformed and refashioned. So Trueman makes the observation that we're living in this secular world. I think 2 symbolic or 2 emblematic things, a couple books I've cited to recently. One is called The Great Dechurching that came out last year that mentions that every single denomination is going through some kind of upheaval, some kind of transition. And The Great Dechurching points out that there are about 40 million Americans who no longer attend church and go to church. Now, I know the latest Pew study that's came out has maybe those things have tapered off. I pray that is the case. but it talks about the loss of Christianity, the loss of regular church attendance. And as we sort of talked about this morning, or in the first session, all of those people are ordering their lives by something. Something is guiding them. Something is guiding the way they raise their kids, the way they raise their marriage. Something is guiding them. And so if they're not being church, if they're not driven by Christian mores, they're driven by something else. The other book that I think is fascinating is called Nonverts. It's a book by a British sociologist named Stephen Bullivant that talks about, he calls them nonverts. You've heard of the nuns. That's the percentage that have left the church. He calculates what percentage of the nuns used to go to church. And it's somewhere around 70-75% of the nuns were active churchgoers, particularly in the early 2000s. So they are nonverts. They have deconverted. The thing, if you read Nonverts, the thing that I've written about that I find so staggering, and maybe some of you feel this when you're in churches, is there's a lot of people that, of course, leave the church for reasons of immorality or whatever. But the one thing that feels like a theme is just total apathy. The church offers me absolutely nothing. And I just don't care. I'm just busy. And I got a lot going on. And it's just sort of this attitude of the church no longer providing social cohesion to our cultures and in our communities. Now, things might be different in Longview. I don't know what it might be like here. It might be definitely different here than it might be, let's say, in New England or in other places. But so when we go back to the early church, I see, in other words, that the discussion of nons and nonverts and stuff lays out. I very much see the resonances between the early Christian pagan world and the secular world in which we find ourselves. So what can we learn from the early church? Well, of course, I want you to buy my book and pore over it, but I'm going to boil things down here to three things. Three things. One is identity, two is discernment, and three is hope. These are key themes in my chapters. Okay. What the early church taught me, and I talked a little bit more about it, particularly in the first session, is that in this day, in a secular age, we are competing for our understandings of identity. Now, of course, if you've read people like Truman and others, they point out the way identity today is often formed. He uses examples like expressive individualism is probably the most common, where my identity is decided internally, and I get to express it regardless of any external institutions or traditions. Nothing external to me really tells me who I am. I decide who I am, and then I live out who I am. So it doesn't matter what the church tells me. It doesn't matter what society tells me. It doesn't matter what my school tells me or my parents tell me. That is a very common sort of way of understanding identity. But as you can see from Polycarp, the reason I love Polycarp's discussion is he says, I am a Christian. His fundamental identity is his understanding of his relationship with God, his relationship with Christ. I am a Christian. And from there, everything else was refracted through that lens. So identity, I argue, is formed from three things: what we believe, doctrine; morality, how we live; and then the worship that is set up to reinforce those things. If you read both of my books, I spend a lot of time talking about worship. I think going to church is good. Even when you don't want to, even when it's a struggle, it's forming. Just being with God's people, the words you say, the prayers you pray, the worship you do, that is forming in 1,000 million ways. Do not neglect the habit of gathering together. And so I think worship is a key component. So what you believe, how you live, and the liturgy that is forged. I also have a chapter that I think you might find interesting in that on the notion of citizenship. And one thing I really find fascinating about the early church is they never reject the earthly rule. It's fascinating. They are not Gnostics in the sense they look around at political authorities and they think political authorities are fundamentally evil. That's actually what the early Christian heretics called Gnostics said. In a Gnostic view, the material world is bad and the spiritual world is all that mattered. So they looked around at the political structures and they said, these things, The apostle Peter said, fear God, honor the king. They told me that. Or Paul wrote, right? Have respect for political authorities. And so I talk about recovering in the early church a deep sense of citizenship. God has placed me here in this moment among these people in this day to live for him. I don't always like what they're doing, but I don't always like what they say, but you know what? I am here. I am an earthly citizen inhabiting this place to the glory of God. So it's fascinating to watch those in the early church who lived in a deeply pagan world just talk about how, even like the church father Tertullian has a really great line where he says, the emperor gets his scepter from the same God who gave him his breath. God is in control. And that's what Polycarp is saying. Look, man, I can't deny the ultimate king because I have an ultimate authority. So this deep sense of transcendence, of God's providence, an understanding that God is in control. This is his world. We are the sheep of his pasture. The early church really had to lean into that understanding of citizenship. And I spend a lot of time talking about an early Christian vision of citizenship that I think can help us in these days and help our people as they think about what it means to be a Christian citizen. But I'm going to give you just a taste of an early Christian sense of identity. This is, if you never read this epistle, this is one of the apostolic fathers. It's called the Epistle of Diognetus. Diognetus is a pagan. And in the first chapter of Cultural Sanctification, my introduction, I walk through 2 chapters of this letter that I think are so exemplary and pivotal. In fact, James Davidson Hunter is a modern commentator on kind of cultural engagement. He wrote a book called To Change the World that really reflects on how we engage our culture today. His conclusion ends with this epistle. In other words, James Davidson Hunter, who's one of the most prominent sociologists today, looks around and say, okay, the Epistle of Diognetus, I think we need to look back at this. Stephen Smith, who's a constitutional lawyer at University of San Diego, wrote a book called Pagans and Christians in the City. It's a fascinating read. He goes back to the Epistle of Diognetus and talks about how Diognetus can help us kind of engage our world. Listen to these words. Christians are not distinguished. This is mid-second century, where a Christian is trying to explain what a Christian is to a pagan who doesn't understand Christianity, like a Paul on Mars Hill. Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by language, country, or custom. For nowhere do they live in cities of their own, nor do they speak an unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric lifestyle. In other words, there is no specific Christian country. Instead, the church has taken up shop in a whole lot of countries and influenced a whole lot of countries in a whole variety of ways, constructing relationships between church and state in a whole variety of ways. But he's saying, look, there's not a specific people, a specific country, a specific language. The church takes up shop and then indigenizes within that community and sets up shop there and inhabits those cultural spaces. The teaching of the Christians has not been discovered by the thought or the reflection of ingenious men. The philosophers do not give you the source of truth. They're like, oh, what is true? You imagine Plato or Aristotle thinking deeply with their reason. The epistle is saying, look, we have been given revelation. We have been told what is true from God. And yeah, you may say some really interesting things. In fact, I like some of the things you say. But you know what? You don't have the source of truth, which is the scriptures. So Christianity has not been taught by the thought and reflection of ingenious men, nor do they promote any human doctrine. But while they live in Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast, they follow the local customs in dress and food and other aspects of life. Yet at the same time, they demonstrate the remarkable and admitted unusual character of their own citizenship. It's fascinating. They look like everyone else. So when I usually use the illustration, when I lived in Scotland, when I was working on my PhD, I loved fish and chips. I just soaked it up. I ate all the fish and chips. And in Scotland, there is a soft drink called Iron Brew that is like their national drink. They eat it with their fish and chips. They love Iron Brew. It tastes a little bit like maybe like Orange Crush. It's like an orange crush drink. It outsells Coca-Cola. They love it. Iron Brew. They love to there are all these commercials for Iron Brew. And so when I was there, I had my fill of fish and chips. I had my fill of Iron Brew and haggis and the good things Scotland has to offer, right? But I missed my Tex-Mex. And I missed home. And I missed Texas and my Whataburger and all the good things. And so when I'm here, I soak up these good things. I participate in the good things that God has given to us in this culture or in that culture. I also missed Fountain Dr. Pepper. That's what I usually say, Fountain Dr. Pepper. Not the bottled, the sweet nectar that's from God that you put your cup under and it's just like, it just comes down, the beautiful. I went to Baylor. What do you say? I'm a Baylor boy. So, but you notice the church takes up all the residents and they participate, yet their citizenship is unusual because they fear God and honor the king. They have a dual citizenship that are trying to work out. So the people they inhabit a cultural space with, they're constantly trying to say, look, I love you, I will serve you, I will participate, but I am obedient to a higher authority, like Daniel, like Jonah, like so many others in the scriptures they have an unusual vision of citizenship. And the epistle goes on to say this: Christians live in their own countries, but as aliens. They participate in everything as citizens, yet they endure everything as foreigners. Every country is their fatherland. Every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else. They have children, but they do not expose their offspring. They do not kill their babies. Exposing their offspring was a common practice for an unwanted child that you didn't want. You would go expose it to the elements. Christians, it was reported, would go and gather those babies and try to raise them within the community. In other words, the church, we have a different doctrine and we have a different morality, although at times we drink our Dr. Pepper and we eat our Tex-Mex and we do so with a particular moral vision in this life. We do not expose our offspring. We share our food, but not our wives, right? We have a particular sexual morality. We remain committed in marriage to our spouses. We live in the flesh, but not according to the flesh. Romans, Paul, 2nd century. Paul is already guiding their embedded spiritual lives. We obey established laws, yet indeed in our private lives, we transcend those laws. I often talk about Paul. If you think about Paul before Festus, what does he say? I have done nothing wrong. I appeal to Caesar. He's utilizing the legal structures of the world in which he lives to continue to preach and proclaim the gospel. He is a citizen. He is embedded. He understands the civil authority above him, and so he obeys established laws, but he transcends those laws by his life. We love everyone, yet by everyone we are persecuted. We are unknown, yet we are condemned. We are put to death, yet we are brought to life. We are poor, yet we are rich. We are in need of everything, yet we abound in everything, and so on and so on. It's a beautiful kind of discussion. And then he sums it up in one word. Okay, he says in one word, what the soul is to the body, the church is to the world. It's an incredible image. This ragtag group of people in the 2nd century think, oh, the creator of the universe is actually cares about us. And oh, by the way, Roman Empire, we are the ones through which God is working out salvation. The Messiah has come through the Jewish line. The Messiah has come and built a church and a kingdom. Right? And it's staggering to think about this ragtag group of Christians in the 2nd century that make the case what the soul is to the body, the church is to the world. The church inhabits the world. The church animates the world. The church blesses the world. The church is salt and light in the world. The church and the people of God bring to the world the goodness of God. When they see the church, they see the people of God living in beauty and harmony and joy and all the fruits of the Spirit that are laid out. I pray that our people in our churches are what the epistle lays out. I know our struggles. I know what it's like to be in our churches and among our communities. And it was like that in the 2nd century. But the church is trying to make the apologetic that true human flourishing is found in the church, not in any other community, nor in any other society. We are your best citizens is a constant cry of the apologists. Okay, so that's identity. I could spend a lot more time kind of unpacking it. I do it in the book. The second one is discernment, the virtue of discernment. And I talk about discernment in two senses. One, the intellectual life, and two, the public life. Now, with discernment, I think one thing you could point out is, some of you have noticed this, the rise of intellectuals that are coming to see the beauty of the Christian life. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is one, Tom Holland is one, Rosaria Butterfield is one. There's so many that look around and just go, you know what? Human flourishing is not found. The good life is not found in a life outside the church and what ultimately the scriptures teach about life with God. Ayaan Hirsi Ali particularly is an interesting case. She was raised as a Muslim. She escaped. She became an atheist. She was trained by Richard Dawkins. She was a disciple of Richard Dawkins. She was one of the most prominent atheists of our day. She wrote an account of her conversion experience where she basically said, the only hope for Western civilization is Christianity. That's the only hope we have. All right? If you want to see the people, if you want to see society flourish, you better start going to church. Because in church, you find the morality, you find the theology, you find the kind of life that reinvigorates the institutions in positive ways. In that chapter, I talk a lot about, I mentioned it this morning, I use the image of improvisation. Because I'm trying to explain how the early church is constantly interacting with a whole variety of challenges. I'll just give you a very brief example. The first session I mentioned Hippolytus is on the apostolic tradition. That's the earliest church manual we have. And in that manual, it gives an account of what is an early Christian interview. Someone's interested in joining the church, and they're brought before an early Christian leader. And this is what the text says about the interview that ensues. Those who are newly brought forward to hear the word or be discipled or catechized shall be brought before the teachers of the house before everyone entered. Then they're questioned concerning the reason they have come. Those who bring them bear witness. It reminds me of my Southern Baptist years of someone walking the aisle with a friend. I've brought this person. They've made a good confession. I know they actually believe. Someone has brought them. So there's evangelism happening outside. They're bringing this person to the church to see if they're discipled. Then they are questioned concerning their life and occupation, concerning their marriage status, whether or not they are slave or free. If someone is a gladiator or teaches gladiator shows, they shall cease or be rejected. If someone is a pimp or a procurer of prostitutes, they shall cease or be rejected. If someone is a priest of idols or an attendant of idols, they shall cease or be rejected. And it's actually, if you just walk through, if someone is a school teacher, it is good that they cease, but if they cannot find another profession, the text says, let them continue, just be cautious, because to be a school teacher, you had to teach the pagan gods. You had to communicate paganism. So you're suddenly like, oh, yeah, I can't. And you can see this text captures the kind of discernment the early church has to have to navigate the specifics of reality in life in a pagan world. And it's just, there's so many one-to-one correlations between us trying to navigate with your people who are embedded in all kinds of institutions, trying to live the Christian life and make wise decisions. In my book on biblical theology, I talk a lot about the wisdom literature. I think the wisdom literature right now is our gateway to figure out how to live wisely in a pagan world. The early church often relied on the wisdom literature to help them navigate business, help them navigate school, help them navigate. And I call it improvisation because, again, one time I was speaking on this and they asked me if it was like Michael Scott and Michael Scarn. I said, no, Michael Scott doesn't do good improv. I'm thinking of a jazz musician here who is discipled in jazz and can really perform because they know the tunes. They've inhabited the doctrine and the morality of what it means to be a jazz musician. They know how to perform. Doesn't mean they don't mess up on occasion. Doesn't mean there aren't challenges. Okay, all of that, I think discernment is a virtue that the early church tried to cultivate. I give plenty of examples in my book, and I'll end with hope. I end with hope Because as I was reading through the early church, I'll tell you what, I was struck by how hopeful people in a pagan world could be. I was really struck. And in the book, I tell the story of I went to train some missionaries, and I was doing some work training some missionaries, and they were all going off to foreign countries that are not Christian countries. And they were taking their families, and they were learning languages, and they were overjoyed. I can't wait to get on the mission field. Now, I know what waits them are a lot of challenges on the other side, but it just struck me the joy of going to serve in a pagan world, a world embedded with idols and idolatry, and the joy of the Lord. Christ is king, and I sense that hope, even in the Martyrdom of Polycarp. For 86 years I've served him. I cannot deny my king and my Savior now. You offer up a fire that will burn and be distinguished. Don't you know there's a fire coming? Justin Martyr, one of the early Christian apologists, wrote a book called First Apology to Antonius Pius, the emperor. And he ends his apology going, look, if you'd like anything I said, great. I'd love for you to become a Christian. If not, Christ is coming again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and he'll establish the kingdom on that day. And I hope it goes well for you. We'll see you then, all right? We'll see how it goes. And it's sort of like, there is just a deep, resonating love for the theological virtue of hope, that we get caught up in sort of the immediate challenges that lay before us. And the early church constantly reverts back to that vision of hope. Christ is going to come again in glory. You can be assured of it. Just as they saw him go up, so he shall return. And you know what? We are facing all kinds of challenges and all kinds of social and cultural difficulties. But the early church really inspired me. So the whole last chapter, I talk about that theological virtue of hope. And I talk about preaching hope, living in hope, walking in hope. And I specifically say, because they leaned on hope, it made them better citizens. Because they had hope, it freed them up. Do what you will, come what may. I will embed myself and I will do everything I can for the glory of God and the furthering of his kingdom right now, because I know Christ is going to come again. Anyway, I could go on. I give lots of examples of hope in the early church. And that's that frames that book: identity, discernment, and hope. And I think it's those themes that animate the early Christian cultural engagement. And to tie it back with biblical theology, I think all of those themes emanate from the scriptures. They see themselves living the scriptures and see the kingdom coming as part of that grand story of God.